I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism.
Get non-election deniers into federal office. Frame the issue so that people understand the importance of upholding the vote. Talk about the economic risks as well as the political risks. Talk about the need for people, regardless of their partisan jersey, to uphold rule of law.
Hi, friends. It's Tuesday, October 29th, and there's 1 week to go until the last day of voting in the 2024 election. This past weekend, the Trump campaign held a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, wherein a comedian called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Stephen Miller proclaimed America is for Americans and Americans only, and one of the speakers openly called it a Nazi rally, perhaps to commemorate the 1939 Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, which was sponsored by the German Bund. This rally was a call to arms and insurrection, rather than a plea for votes. Barely coded, the rally called upon MAGA Trumpers, militia members, Nazi wackos, and cult members to accelerate their plans for civil war. But something else happened that I doubt Trump's team, who vetted every speech, joke, and comment in advance, anticipated. The rally reached politically disengaged people who weren't going to vote and convinced them that if Trump were to win, the United States could become the hellscape that Trump already calls it. Furthermore, and this is a biggie, the comments on Puerto Rico as an island of garbage immediately made the rounds among Puerto Rican communities across the United States. How did that happen? Celebrities, musicians, and influencers from Puerto Rico highlighted this to their very large, enormous, gigantic social media audiences in both Spanish and English. Regular folks who maybe don't vote that often heard from Bad Bunny or J-Lo or Mark Anthony, and they sat up and paid attention because the message isn't coming from the campaign. And they can get past the baked-in Trump is a racist and move on to this is what Trump will do to me. They remember Hurricane Maria and Trump throwing paper towels but withholding aid. And it might motivate them, those who were planning on sitting out this election, because they didn't think politics really applied to them. Now, as you all know, Puerto Rico is an American territory, also known as a colony, which we don't say out loud, and Puerto Ricans are American citizens who can vote if they have residence on the mainland. This weekend, Puerto Rican cultural icons spontaneously endorsed Harris after the rally and activated a lot of Puerto Ricans, many of whom live in swing states. Approximately 5.8 million people of Puerto Rican heritage live in every state of the Union. Here are some numbers that might put this in perspective for you. In Florida, there are 1.7 million Puerto Ricans. In Georgia, 100,000. North Carolina, 115,000. Pennsylvania, 472,000. Ohio, almost 140,000. Wisconsin, 61,000. And in New York, 1 million Puerto Ricans. Of course, we don't know how many people might have been convinced to vote or change their choice for president. But we do know that numbers such as these can swing elections, and perhaps the Trump campaign bit off a little bit more than they anticipated, with the racism and xenophobia dialed up to 11 million at that rally. That's speculation at this point. What isn't speculation is that Trump and the Republicans will try to cheat to overturn the election if they lose. In advance of the election, Republicans have tried to suppress the vote, purge people from the voter rolls, and generally discourage voting. My conversation with Jonathan Weiner, an election attorney who worked closely with John Kerry and subsequent elections, talks about what could happen at every stage between November 5th and January 6th. He's mostly talking about the requirements of the Electoral College Reform Act, which passed in 2022 to make shenanigans less likely. Here are the major points you should know before listening to the conversation. First, the Electoral College Reform Act requires that states appoint electors on Election Day and eliminates the concept of failed elections, allowing states to extend voting in the case only of a major natural disaster. It does not allow state legislators to step in and appoint electors themselves after Election Day. It does not allow claims of fraud to trigger an exception to appointing electors on Election Day. It makes clear that state executives must certify the state's electors 6 days before the Electoral College meets. This means governors must certify or ascertain the result by December 11th, and the Electoral College meets on December 17th. This new law gives the courts an expedited role in resolving disputes about states' electors. It seeks to ensure that only one lawful slate of electors is presented to Congress to count. It makes clear that the VP role is only ceremonial. And, perhaps most importantly, it changes the ability of Congress to object to a state's results. Before, only one member of each house was needed to challenge a state's electoral results. Now, the law changes that threshold, and 1/5 of the members of both chambers is needed to contest the result from any state, while requiring a majority vote of each chamber to sustain an objection to any state's results. I'm making these rules very clear here so that my conversation with Jonathan Weiner makes more sense, since he sometimes uses verbal shortcuts that aren't as clear as I would want them to be. One other thing. Jonathan Weiner provides a prescription of what we can do to stop the shenanigans and curtail Trump's effort to steal the election. The first is to speak out loudly and clearly that all votes must be counted. The second is to talk about the social and economic risks of chaos should the election be uncertain. And third, to contact our representatives about the need to uphold the law. You can be thinking of these actions as we discuss the moments of peril throughout the process, and no doubt you can think of more. Weiner wrote out his thoughts in an article in the Washington Spectator, which I'll link to in the notes. You can also watch the uncut video of this interview on YouTube. I'll link that in the notes as well. And finally, please, please, please subscribe to the podcast on www.freedomoverfascism.us. If you can afford it, maybe you canceled your Washington Post, LA Times, or USA Today subscriptions, please choose a paid subscription. But if you can't, the content of this podcast and my essays is always free. Now for my conversation with Jonathan Weiner, which occurred before the Madison Square Garden debacle. Jonathan Weiner, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Thank you, Stephanie. Let's always have freedom over fascism. When you have former senior officials from the military and otherwise calling their former boss a fascist, the epitome of a fascist, that's really striking. It's disturbing. And it's important to notice, pay attention to, and take action on.
Absolutely. One of the reasons we have you here is so you can help us understand how we can take action. Can you tell our listeners who are activists a little bit about yourself and why I'm talking to you today?
Sure. I was a journalist first, writing about legal issues, became an attorney, became counsel to Senator John Kerry, helped him get elected, worked on campaign finance and election issues for him for about 10 years. So I had practical involvement in campaigns. I worked on his presidential campaign and his debate preparation, among other things. And I've been working on the issues relating to elections, election law, for a very long time. And in recent years, I was also at the State Department working on these kinds of issues in part all over the world as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for international law enforcement. And I've been writing a lot over the past 5 years about the particular threat Donald Trump poses to democracy. I hosted a podcast series 4 years ago in which I warned of a bunch of terrible things that could happen. And I thought my views were extreme. The podcast was called Unconventional Threat. And it turned out they weren't extreme. They actually somewhat understated how bad it was going to be. Not very much, as we anticipated an awful lot of it. And so since then, I've been looking closely at how Trump is going to try to overturn any election he loses, which he will try to do, and have analyzed exactly the mechanics of it all the way to the end. It gets very complicated, but there are some basic things which we can be sure of.
So first, we know that he's going to try to cheat to win the election, right? They've already started voter suppression efforts to purge the voting rolls. I think what we ought to talk about is what happens on and after election day. What will they try to do to win? And failing that, what will they try to do to steal or to engineer a coup?
Phase one, which we're going through now, is our voter suppression efforts, very traditional and untraditional mechanisms to try and prevent people from voting and then have the vote not get counted. So if somebody votes to say this vote is illicit for the following reasons. And it's also to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt amongst all Americans and certainly all of their people that the election's results are valid. And I'm not going to get back to that point because it's the fundamental one. If they lose 100 court battles, 1,000 court battles, if they win 5 and lose 995, they can say all the ones we lost are proof that this election is no good because we raised legitimate issues and we got no remedy from the courts. So they'll try and delay certifications at the state level, at the county level. They'll then call into question those certifications, which are done by the governors pretty much. They may then try and prevent the Electoral College from meeting when it's supposed to meet. So there's two important phases. The first phase is the governors say, we determine the results. Secretary of State and all the state officials say, here's how many votes there were in this county, this town, that town, and so on. And we found that Harris has won our state by blank votes.
Right.
Recount efforts, whatever, but there'll be efforts to prevent certification. When the governor certify, and there's a date under the Electoral Count Reform Act, which is the law that was passed 2 years ago to try and protect our elections after what Trump did last time. Once the governors do that ascertainment, there'll be lawsuits trying to invalidate that. And those, I am confident, will fail.
Do you think the Republican governors will certify as they ought to, or do you think some will refuse to certify?
It's possible. There's a particular wrinkle where they don't just refuse to certify the presidential one, but they refuse to certify members of Congress who won their districts. We call this the Greg Abbott scenario in Texas, where in order to hold on to the House, they decide that X number of Democratic seats won't be certified. And my answer to that is let them go do that. If they're going to go do that, presumably Gavin Newsom can invalidate the same number or even more Republicans, then every governor in the country can start invalidating. And this ludicrous approach, tragicomic approach, I think in the end the courts say, no, this is unconstitutional. This is a denial of equal protection. There are a number of answers to those kinds of stunts. So I think it's possible, but my personal belief is that in the end, the courts will uphold state election laws, which are determine the results, not state politicians.
Right.
State politicians, even individual state officials, have to follow the law. And the law is pretty clear, which is why you had Republican secretaries of state, governors behave last time round.
Mm,
While there were
right.
some election officials who didn't behave, it wasn't very many, and they were forced in the end to certify. Here, the goal is not necessarily to win the battles on certification if you're a Trump supporter. It's to say, look what a mess all of this is. We've been denied our rights. We made valid arguments. We lost. We have to take further action. What's the further action? And this is where my focus has been for a while now, because there are really good lawyers all the way up to the point where it becomes physical or political. So let's talk about the physical first and then
Yes,
go to the political. Does that work for you, Stephanie?
that works for me. Let's start at the point where the governors certify their state
Yeah. So they
and see
certify
what
that,
happens there.
that's called
A-
ascertainment.
ascertain.
And so we've ascertained that the electors for Kamala Harris are the correct electors because she has won the state. And they need to meet in the state capitol on the day determined by the Electoral Count Reform Act, which is December 17th. And state law says where they are to meet. Then they're to meet on the designated date under federal law. but they are to meet in a particular location, pretty much every state.
Makes them a little vulnerable.
It makes them a little vulnerable. So what's going on is that in the swing states, particular, the purple states or swing states, governors are preparing for the risk to this event. Now, one of the interesting things in our system that people don't always pay attention to is that the National Guard is both federal and state. And the president controls the National Guard, but he's not the only one who does, or she.
Right.
The governors do as well. Some cases, states, it's not even the governors, it's other senior officers that are designated, usually working with the governor. So you can protect the state capital if you need to with National Guard. And you have to be very sensitive to get the intelligence on the ground as to what's going on. And it's not really very easy to organize an armed or unarmed rebellion or interference with people coming to vote. You can do it, but it's hard to do it without leaving fingerprints. It's hard to do it in secret because
Do they care if they
yeah,
leave fingerprints?
I think you care a lot because if you're not doing it in secret, if it's come to the Capitol, it will be wild, as Mr. Trump did last time when he was still president. The government's supposed to respond to protect the electors. So there are various things that can be done to protect the electors and to ensure that they get in. And I think the governors are going to do that. So while there's real risk that day, which is December 17th, it's a risk that can be prepared for. Now let's pretend that they do shut down Capitol. And so instead of meeting in the Capitol, they just outside the Capitol. They meet in the governor's home. They meet in some other building nearby. Under some state laws, you can designate an alternative place. That's right there in the state law. A governor has the right to do it. We've just had a lightning storm. The Capitol was struck by the lightning bolt. The building was demolished. Something blew up. Whatever. That can happen. And if some of the state's laws allow it, you can do it. The problem is that assuming that happens and they all meet under state law, but not in the Capitol, you're creating an issue. And we know what Rudy Giuliani would have done with that issue 4 years ago. We
Right.
know what the others on Trump's election team would have done with that 4 years ago, and they'll do it again. That's not valid. They didn't meet in the Capitol. No matter that it was impossible, that's not valid. Doesn't matter. At that point, the governors said they meet, they sign, they get sent to Washington. So we've just talked about violence, really, and because if you're preventing them from getting in, that's the use of physical force to prevent our democracy from functioning as it's supposed to or under rule of law. So that would be illegal activity, criminal activity, might well be a criminal conspiracy, and
Right.
people could face serious criminal penalties if they were to participate in any of that.
And since Joe Biden is still the president, it's easier to move the levers of power than if it's Trump sitting in his
That's right.
office next door to the
That's right.
Oval.
And so I would think the National Guard, if need be, will be called out by state governors or by the White House for the purpose of making it possible for the electors to vote. So my assumptions are actually quite optimistic about the fact that there'll be all kinds of challenges and bad things happening, and that our country is sturdy enough to get through all of them until the last couple of stages, which we're going to get to next, which are
Right.
where I start to worry. So do I worry about ascertainment and certifications coming in a timely fashion? I think it's going to be litigated with the goal of delaying it. In
Well,
the
that
end,
seems to be a pattern.
yeah, I think that's what they'll do. But I also believe that the courts will not allow themselves to be manipulated that way. There may be individual loose cannons, but the
Right.
system in the end, I think, will cause certifications to be made that are the correct ones, whatever they are.
Okay.
That's my belief.
That
I could be wrong. I hope I'm right.
right.
Then,
I hope you're right too.
then I think there could be efforts to prevent the Electoral College from meeting, and I think that will be overcome in the end by a mixture of rule of law, court orders, and, if necessary, physical protection. So that takes us to late December. In late December, one can imagine efforts by the outgoing Congress under the control of Mike Johnson, an election denier in the House, to try to interfere with or prevent the new House from coming into power. But the old Congress doesn't get to decide anything about the new Congress. New Congress comes. Who are the correct people to vote is decided under state law.
Mhm.
And so if the courts have determined who the right winner is, I believe in the end that's going to have to be also honored. It could be very messy. And you could have a situation where there's no speaker elected, or in which there's two speakers elected, purportedly, because the parties disagree as to who the valid members of Congress are. But of course, you're supposed to be sworn in by the president or by the secretary of the Senate. There's that part of it as well. So there's a lot of little things that can happen messing around in that period to establish the new Congress. But let's pretend none of that's resolved particularly well,
Okay.
and that there are stunts like what I call the Greg Abbott stunt, which has been discussed. Doesn't mean he's going to do it, but there have been rumblings about it. At that point, you have a situation where Senator Josh Hawley said in 2020, when we had 2/3 of the Republicans in the House after the insurrection voting to decertify states 5-1, 4 or 5 of them, after they had just been attacked, cowering under desks, threatened,
Right.
stalked, brutalized, and 2/3 of them still said, we're going to vote to decertify. Only a couple of senators did. Maybe it was only Ted Cruz. But what Josh Hawley said was very interesting. What he said was, now we get to choose. We get to decide and review it. We understand the courts have finished their review. We understand the governors have finished their review. But we have the chance to make a decision. That's not really how our law works or is supposed to work, because the grounds under the Electoral Count Reform Act, and before that, the Electoral Count Act, going back to the late 19th century, is that you can only reject certifications on the grounds that a certification wasn't regularly given or wasn't the actual result, in effect, is defective because it wasn't the actual result. These are supposed to be very narrow, based on objective criteria, like Trump really won Pennsylvania based on the votes certified by the Secretary of State, but Josh Shapiro put the Democratic electors in anyway. That would be a legitimate, not regularly given. Or Harris really won Texas based on the vote counts in Texas, and Governor Greg Abbott chose to send the Trump electors in anyway. In those cases, that would not be regularly given. In the other case, which is that it's not essentially a proper elector, goes to someone who's too young to be a candidate that's too young, wrong age, wasn't born in the United
Mm,
States.
correct.
It's supposed to deal with those kinds of extreme examples where it's cut and dry that the person isn't qualified to be president because they can't, under the Constitution, be president. It's not that. I think that the vote counting was wrong. I think somebody cheated. I think it was fraud. I think it was rigged. But the problem with that is, while we know what the correct legal answer is, how do you enforce that legal answer? So when Josh Hawley gets together with 19 other senators and votes to decertify Arizona, if Arizona went for Harris, and there are 87 members of the House, it's 1/5 of the House, which would less than half of the
Right.
Republican caucus. It would be 2/3 of the Republican caucus is all you would need. The houses then separate, and each house votes as to whether to decertify her. And so you can imagine a situation at that point where the House votes certified, or the Senate does. Now, this gets really complicated if there isn't a Speaker of the House, because there hasn't been agreement on that, or if there's two competing houses. But there is a scientific, verifiable answer to the question of who actually won the seat, pretty much everywhere, based on the votes. And so in the end, the courts ought to be able to resolve questions about who's in and who isn't. But the Constitution also says the House and the Senate organize themselves. So in a situation of very little trust, it could get really messy. But in the end, under the Electoral Count Reform Act, like the Electoral Count Act before it, both chambers have to say, no, Arizona was no good. Both chambers. And what Susan Collins, the author in the Senate of the Electoral Count Reform Act, says is we designed the reforms to make it harder to screw things up and to make it much easier for the actual counts to be respected and to ensure that. So the most important bulwark we have to protect our democracy, keep our republic, are Republican senators such as Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who's very independent, for
Right.
starters, and Todd Young, a very conservative senator from Indiana, who is part of the Electoral Count Reform Act process and has talked about the need to uphold it, saying we're not going along with any efforts to decertify anybody. We respect the governors. We respect that the governors have done the right thing by their voters. And there doesn't seem to be any question about who won the vote. And if a few of them do that, that could save the country from this gigantic mess.
That's pretty I have faith in Lisa Murkowski. Susan Collins gets very concerned, although she did write the bill, and Todd Young is quite radical.
But
So
he's been good on this issue so far and has addressed it pretty explicitly.
okay,
And Susan Collins is addressing it explicitly. Now, I have real questions about whether she has her finger on the pulse of her party and is speaking frankly, because what she said lately is she can't imagine how you could get 20 Republicans in the Senate voting to decertify. That's what
that's
she said within the last week or two. And so I can't
one
imagine,
wonders.
I can't myself can't imagine how you could have more than a handful saying no to Donald Trump, given what we've seen so far in the purging of anyone who doesn't do what he wants. So I think there's a big risk, but part of the risk is Supreme Court risk. And so we talked about law and how confident I am that the law is going to protect us and how robust it is. We then talked about the threats of violence or interference. And we discussed why I thought in the end that would work out probably too. Then we talk about politics, where, as Josh Hawley says, we get to decide. It's not the voters, it's not the governors. Constitution gives us the right to decide. Now, actually, it doesn't. 12th Amendment says they sit there. Doesn't say they choose to decide. But that's never been determined by any Supreme Court so far. We
Right.
don't have an ultimate Supreme Court ruling on the degree to which senators and Republicans have discretion. Ideally, you would save the court from itself. You would save the court from the risk of the court devolving into a partisan institution to just deliver an election to Trump. Now, that might happen. Here's the risk. You have 20 Republican senators and 87 Republican members of Congress voting to decertify Arizona. Each of these, by the way, has to be debated separately. So after you reach a conclusion on Arizona, you then get to go to whatever your next state in contention might be. Maybe it's Georgia, maybe it's Michigan, maybe it's Pennsylvania, and you get to Wisconsin. You could go beyond that because if you could have 20 Democrats and 87 Democrats and say, we're going to debate Texas, we're going to debate Florida, we're going to debate Oklahoma. We'll debate all 50 if
Mhm.
that's the way you're going. The Electoral Count Reform Act allows you to do that, but there's a couple hours debate on each of those. So it would be a very ugly pathway if they decide to go this way. But the requirement, again, is both chambers. So if a few Republican senators say no, probably that chamber wouldn't vote to decertify, only the House. And in that case, at that point, the states go through and you've elected Harris president. So she's actually won the Electoral College. as the law defines a win. But the additional risk is if they get the Supreme Court involved, the Supreme Court might have different ways of screwing things up. Now, if you've got Republicans like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, and maybe it isn't Todd Young, maybe it's Mitch McConnell, who decides there are levels of chaos that's too much for him. I think in that situation, it's much less likely that the Republicans on the Supreme Court are going to make a partisan ruling because they're going to see that not only would it create chaos and tear the country apart and create potential violence, which we'll talk about in a bit, but could be seen as invalid when Republicans have already sent it wrong. The need to have Republican politicians honor their obligations to the country at this moment is utterly critical. And the need to talk about it. Let every voter be allowed to vote, let every vote be counted, and make sure the counts stand. That mantra is really going to be critical to creating a political framework that the country will survive. Now, if they get the election to the House of Representatives due to no one having majority in the electoral count, because you could go tit for tat, Republicans, Democrats challenging one another's respective counts. The Republicans will win. They're going to control at least 26 states based on gerrymandering at the state level that affects the number of people in Congress and what parties they belong to.
Because each
And
state would have its own vote.
each state vote gets one vote. So Wyoming gets a vote, Texas gets a vote, California gets a vote, New York, everyone gets one vote. And on that, the Republicans win, even if the Democrats were to control the House. And even if they were to control it by a decent number, almost
Right.
certainly Republicans would win. Given all of that, the Supreme Court could potentially try and deliver to a contingent election, which the Republicans would win. They could say one house's objections are enough. It doesn't require two. That's what the Electoral Count Reform Act says, but we're going to interpret the 12th Amendment to require both. Is that pulled out of thin air? Yes.
Well, that
Do I,
doesn't seem to have stopped them.
do I know what language I would use, how I would write their opinion to find it unconstitutional in that area and to say one house is enough? I could write that opinion. Wouldn't take me an afternoon. Is it legitimate? No. Can they do it? Yes. So it's a legal political situation or a political legal situation, not just a legal.
Correct.
So what can we do, given all that, to avoid these nightmare scenarios? First, it's really important to not elect election deniers to Congress. It's of real importance. The fewer election deniers are, the healthier the country will be. So we'll start with that. Second, it's really important to have that mantra I just talked about. Let every person vote, let the votes be counted, and make sure the counts hold. That becomes really important. And one should also, I think, talk about what the world will look like if the chaos envelops the country. Trump's the chaos candidate. That's what he is. He creates it, he thrives off it, he wins through it. And the more chaos they can create, the better off he is. The courts should be stabilizers. The Supreme Court isn't, but they should be. And to the extent that one starts talking about the economic chaos, as well as the physical chaos that will take place, if this goes into the worst places, becomes very important. I don't know whether you have any investments that you're going to rely on for your retirement, or if any of your friends have investments that they're going to rely on for retirement, or any of them are retired now, or trying to put kids through college, or trying to pay for their mortgages. And if they depend on any kind of economic activity, which could potentially come unglued if the country became. Imagine a situation in which Harris has actually won the state of Pennsylvania, and that those votes aren't counted. Their votes aren't counted because Republicans in Congress have said they refuse to. And the Supreme Court has said, we're not going to interfere. We're not going to force. What happens at that point is economic confidence goes down, business confidence goes down, the stock markets go crazy, and not in a good way. Because one thing we know they don't like is chaos. And we have a business catastrophe and an economic catastrophe. Now, is that what moves me or you, Stephanie? Probably not so much, but there are people who are establishment Republicans, the pillars of the community, the CEOs of companies all across the United States, who, regardless of their partisan preference, are really strongly anti chaos because
Okay.
chaos is really not good for business. And so I think people need to think about the consequences of what happens if rule of law breaks down and we're in a situation where votes are not respected. We could be in a pre Civil War state because you can imagine the partisan passions that will get unleashed if we get into such a situation. So countering chaos at every turn through planning and framing. Planning being things like, when do you bring out the National Guard? How do you protect the vote? Framing is the frame of rule of law and order
Mhm.
and respect for the vote versus chaos. That stuff matters. And the more one talks about the need for the vote to be respected, I think the better off we'll be. And those messages can be heard by some Republican elected officials at the federal level, as well as at the state level. And also emphasizing the fact that conspiracies to overturn elections are punishable under state law and federal law. And while that process is incomplete from 2016-17, it's still ongoing. And there are a lot of people who went to jail for the insurrection. And there are more who could go to jail if people were to try it again. So there are tools.
It seems I hear you say there are tools and there are consequences. But if Trump and the Republicans manage to take power, those consequences disappear.
Oh, if Mr. Trump becomes president, you have to look at what General Milley says would happen, what his former chief of staff, John Kelly, said he tried to do already. And I think it's quite clear he will use the IRS and the Justice Department, now granted direct control. He's been granted direct control of the Justice Department by 6 members of the Supreme Court. He will use those as tools against his political enemies.
And he has
You're speaking to a person who already was the subject of an agreement between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to be interrogated by the Russians, because I was on the list of about a dozen people who Putin asked for, and Trump said, sure, let's do it, in Helsinki, Finland. When Trump then met with Putin off camera with no one else present other than the Russian translator. No
right.
American translator was used. So we don't know what Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin agreed when no one else was present. I do know that I was among the people named to be interrogated by the Russians because of my involvement in something called the Magnitsky Act, which is a human rights law, which has been used to go after Russian officials, among others, who are corrupt and have engaged in serious human rights violations. And because of that background and my involvement with alerting federal officials to contacts between people in the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and what the Russian government was allegedly doing to tilt the election to Trump in 2016. I'm not a friend of Mr. Trump or Mr. Putin.
So let's go back. Where are the points where normal people like us can make a difference in changing the course of this post-election landscape, knowing that the media has not yet shown itself to be responsible for reporting accurately about what's at stake. So, where can people make a difference? Is it in the way they talk on social media, talk to their friends? Is there anything else that people can do to navigate the narrow confines of making it to January 20th?
I think that talking about the risk of chaos if rule of law isn't upheld and how that could hurt everybody, regardless whether you're Republican or Democrat, regardless of who you voted for, is an important framing. or we have chaos, and stability is really a much better way for the country to go. And that's going to affect people economically as well as politically. I think that's important. Most people know and have members of their family who are in the other political party or have been. And talking to them from this frame about the need for the votes to be upheld and for certification to go ahead so the country's not divided and falling apart is really important. And saying that we're going to respect and everybody needs to respect. Now, if Mr. Trump winds up sending people in violently, to use force, and there's always the threat of force in back of what he talks about. He's always playing that game. It could well devolve to a situation where you've got people on both sides fighting. That'd be really bad for the country. Now, talking about Trump, there's an expression that was used during the Hitler years that is actually really important to be aware of. And the expression was called leading towards the Fuhrer. What it meant was, based on what Hitler said, generally, people then said, oh, we should do the things that are consistent with that. He doesn't need to tell us more. He doesn't need to order us to do anything. We're going to do that on the basis of what he's been saying generally. So when Hitler would give a speech about his general goals, any number of people inside the German government would then seek to carry out what they thought he wanted to do. Mr.
Well,
Trump has a similar kind of technique. He goes on, he makes a public statement, used to be a tweet. He is Orwellian. And then people will then do things that they want him to do. And I think we should be very aware that when he makes these statements, it does cause people to respond. And the bulwark against that are people who have been Republican historically and who are willing to take a stand now in favor of the system and upholding the system as opposed to tearing it down. I'm working with people who include a lot of different Republican officials, past officials, judges, senators, members of Congress, state officials, state election officials, who are doing a lot in the swing states on these themes. And they're trying to reach out to the people who voted for them before to take this seriously and approach it this way. And I think it's the single most important thing we can do. People who we don't necessarily agree with on policy, but we do agree with on the basic premise of what it is to be an American and how the country is supposed to function. And I think at the state level, the infection, the virus is not as deep. It's there, but it's not as deep as it now is at the federal level. Because at the federal level, they're so afraid of being targeted by him that even the ones that know better mostly do what he wants.
so this bulwark, the former or current Republicans who are standing up for democracy or for the rule of law, and they've signed open letters, and Liz Cheney has been campaigning with Kamala Harris, and John Kelly came out and talked about Trump meeting the criteria of fascist. Do you think that enough of them will have enough influence to keep this on track?
We have to help them. And the way in which we help them is to do as much as we can in messaging terms, retail and wholesale, after the election, in the period from, say, November 10th, 11th, 12th, through January 6th, to make this be understood as illegitimate if Harris, in fact, has won. If Trump has, in fact, won the popular vote in enough states fairly, granting it's not fair to do voter suppression, but fairly based on the rules that existed and who actually voted. But if he actually wins, the Democrats are going to have to, as upset as we're going to be, as much protection as we're going to want to give ourselves by any means we can, cannot be contested through illegitimate means. And
Right, and the Democrats tend to stay on the side of institutions and legitimacy.
the reason that Al Gore did what he did after the Supreme Court pulled the stunt that it did in 2000, awarding the presidency to George Bush, that Al Gore actually won. And Gore, to preserve the country, did the right thing. Kerry, to preserve and protect the country, did the right thing. I assume Democrats will do the right thing. But this is a
But the
different
right thing doesn't necessarily get you the right results at this point.
but the problem of chaos, once you're fighting in the streets, it becomes really hard to put the country back together. So if Trump legitimately wins, people can have different understandings of the word legitimate. Do I want a Trump presidency? No, I do not want a Trump presidency. But I'm also deeply concerned about what fighting in the streets could do to the country and how you put things back together. It could be very problematic. Rather than think about the worst, let's see if we can get results that avoid the worst. Get non-election deniers into federal office, frame the issue so that people understand the importance of upholding the vote, talk about the economic risks as well as the political risks, talk about the need for people, regardless of their partisan R or D, their partisan jersey, to uphold rule of law.
Mm.
And if people in the newspaper business, if people in the Chamber of Commerce, if people at universities, if people at law schools, if people at churches, any community institution that you participate in where you can potentially ventilate these issues and talk about the difference between the right thing and the wrong thing, I think helps. Now, how many people do we need to do the right thing? Like in individual states, a few thousand votes can make a huge difference. And at the federal level, a small number of different members of Congress and senators can make a huge difference.
So, if you had one action that you would recommend that the listeners take, what would that one action be? And what would the time frame would you say that they need to do it
Well,
in?
there's different actions at different times. For the next 2 weeks, it's get out the vote in the swing states, period. Any action you can do to help get out the vote. And that's it. That's the most important thing. There'll then be a period of time where the messaging about respecting the count and the vote, the messaging becomes the most really important thing from about just November 10th onward. And so in the month of November, it's about respecting the voters' will and how important it is and how essential that is to our stability as a country. We don't want a repeat of an insurrection. We don't want a repeat of a coup effort. Anybody who does those things is putting themselves at risk hugely, as well as their country at risk. And that framing is really important, that messaging element in that period of time. If you've got any contacts with members of Congress of any party, it's really important to talk about these issues. I'm represented by Jamie Raskin. Jamie knows this stuff as well as anybody in the country. He's read my articles for what it's worth, where I laid all of this out. And I think they're very much focused on it and ahead of the game. I think there will be a lot of awareness. If the Democrats control the House of Representatives, they will have a lot of opportunities to prevent many of the stunts. And it makes it much harder for the Supreme Court to deliver this to Mr. Trump illegitimately. So the House really does matter in terms of the partisan control of the House.
One last question. Do you feel that the Democrats up and down the ballot, up and down the levels of official office have been thinking about this enough and have been planning a strategy enough? Or do you think that they should have been more active in thinking ahead?
This year, in a number of the swing states, the governors are working with outside groups to do scenario planning and to think about every protection they can put in place. It's why I'm so much less anxious about all the stunts that are going to be carried out between now and December 17th than I am about the period between January 3rd and January 6th. But it's much harder for them to do what they might want to do between January 3rd and January 6th, assuming that Kamala Harris has actually won, if we do our jobs in the period leading up to those dates. So different things have to happen at different phases. Right now, it's get out the vote. Then it's messages about stability and what happens if the votes aren't respected. And then after that, when you get to that late period, it's really about pressure on individual members of Congress to do the right thing. Donald Trump may be the person who the generals have said are fascists, but when one says, I can ignore the vote, I get to decide, as Josh Hawley did with his black glove salute, which brought back the 1920s and 30s for me,
Yeah.
then freedom over fascism means overcoming the fascists. And that
Well,
means you have to have enough people on your side to do it.
that's right. Thank you so much for talking this through with us. I think is really important for people to know how to contribute to maintaining our freedom and our democracy in our country. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Please leave a rating or review wherever you listen.